Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Knowledge Group webcast, Machine Teaching, Apply AI for Predictive Procurement. My name is Andy McLeod, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. We're going to hand things over right to our speaker. However, I'd just like to point out that over the next few pages, you'll find some useful information regarding some of the mechanics of today's webcast, as well as the participant and company information. So please feel free to review these pages for their information. Now, during this webcast, you'll be sent a survey via email, and if you're applying for continuing education credit, the completion of this survey is mandatory. 3 secret words will be read out at randomly selected times. You'll need to enter these into the survey as proof of attendance. If you've got any questions, feel free to contact us at info@theknowledgegroup.org. These slides also contain some of the answers to our most frequently asked questions. I'd like to thank today's partner firm, Zycus, and please feel free to visit their website for more information. And today we have Richard Watt, the VP of Corporate Development at Zycus, where Richard has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce, and he helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, or TPN, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement. He was also co-founder of B2E Markets, one of the first SaaS, software as a service, sourcing suite providers, and later covered the supply management market as an industry analyst for the Aberdeen Group. So at this moment in time, I'd like to thank Mr. Watt and Zycus for being so helpful and so generous with their time, help, and support in the preparation for this event. And once again, thanks to everyone joining us today. Without further ado, we'll begin our event. Just to advance the slides, just simply say next slide at the end of each page of your presentation. But before we do turn over to Richard, I'd just like to give the first of 3 secret words. Secret word number 1 is procure. That's Procure. So secret word number 1 is procure. We're going to turn things over to slide 8 and over to our speaker, Richard Watt. Richard, over to you.
Thanks so much, and welcome everyone. I think we have a really interesting topic today, and maybe just a word about the theme here, machine teaching. You know, we often talk about the common parlance being machine learning and artificial intelligence, and how those technologies can drive a more predictive and proactive procurement approach. And certainly we're going to talk about all those things, but by talking about machine teaching, perhaps put the emphasis a little bit more on how we get data, really thinking about if our machines are to learn properly, they have to be taught first. So we'll make sure that we don't bypass or skip that critical step to be able to really harness the true potential. So machine teaching, apply AI for predictive procurement. If you take me to the next slide, I think it's maybe just a little bit more of a background on myself, which I think we've already covered. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just give a little bit of context about Zycus. So Zycus is an integrated suite of source-to-pay software modules that comprise this end-to-end sourcing and procurement process. So just a little bit more definition around that. It encompasses both strategic aspects of procurement with tools like spend analytics, sourcing, contract, and supplier management, but also the operational aspects of procurement. So procure to pay and financial savings management, tracking, and reporting. So that's the scope of the solution set. If you'll click again, just a little bit more about Zycus here. We've been recognized as a leader, both by Forrester's Wave for e-procurement and Gartner's Magic Quadrant for strategic sourcing application suites. In fact, with the Gartner Magic Quadrant, 4 consecutive citations as a leader, the most recent one in 2018. So that's just a quick background on who Zycus is. If you'll click to the next slide, we'll get right into the content today. So I want to take you through kind of a 4-step approach for this path towards machine teaching and more effectively being able to apply, therefore, machine learning and artificial intelligence to optimize procurement. And step 1 here, we really want to talk about how do you cleanse your master data at the source? So being able to teach the machines with more accurate, more quality data to provide better insights on the back end. And the kinds of master data that we're talking about really are concentrated around two areas, spend data and supplier information. So most organizations, of course, can tell you how much they've spent in total. What they can't tell you is, at a more granular view, exactly what types of products and services have been purchased in a given category. And those insights are critical to driving more effective strategic sourcing decisions. The other area, of course, is supplier information. So there are lots of suppliers in every organization's vendor or supplier master file. In fact, there's too many of them. Oftentimes, that data set, that repository, is rife with duplications and multiple different iterations of the same supplier name, which then prevents them from being able to synthesize that data and aggregate it correctly. So step one is really looking at that master data and cleansing it at the source, and by applying artificial intelligence to spot patterns in that data, be it spend transactions or supplier name information or parent-child relationships of the suppliers, it progressively learns more and more about what you're buying, who you're buying it from, to more accurately categorize and classify both spend data and supplier information. So that's step one. If you click to the next step, step two is really looking at how AI can then guide your users through the process. So you're starting step one, taking the data you already have and cleansing it, applying artificial intelligence to make it more meaningful to you. But then on a go-forward basis, as you're conducting the normal course of business, you're creating new data. And AI can guide your users through those key decision-making processes to both improve the user experience, but also generate better outcomes. And in the process, a byproduct of the process, generating better data quality on an ongoing basis to, again, make better inferences and insights and decisions ultimately from that data. So if you click ahead to step three then, a big part of this process is if I want to teach my machines, they're not going to be able to learn from any manual paper-based processes. I can't feed them paper. So digitizing the entire source-to-pay process is really a critical enabler here. And one of the things we'll delve into a little bit is not just digitization of the core sourcing and procurement processes, but also sort of the connective tissue to the rest of the organization. So from the standpoint of inputs to the process, how do you digitize incoming requests from different stakeholders in the business? How do you also apply digitization to those categories of spend commonly referred to as tail spend that is not directly under the control or management of the procurement function? And then also looking at the output of the process for digitization and transformation, being able to then report out to the broader organization more effectively about how the procurement organization is performing in terms of efficiencies and savings and so on and so forth. And then finally, if you click to the next step four, we'll kind of look at how do I now leverage innovative technologies like RPA, robotic process automation, to, in fact, in this case, have the machines take the place of people. And that's a little bit of a daunting concept. I think that we're all a little bit wary about the revenge of the robots. But in fact, we'll look at the use cases, and really those are focused on those kind of repetitive, mundane, and transactional tests that humans really don't want to perform anyway, and are not particularly well suited to do. The human element being much more effective around judgment and intuition and experience and those kinds of things. But leveraging a tool like RPA to automate those more repetitive and transactional or tactical tasks, and to do it really flawlessly. So the advantage of these bots, if you will, the robotic process automation software that can automate these tasks, is they run 24/7. They never take a day off, and they do exactly as they're told. So that the ability to take very structured kinds of processes like data entry or integrating disparate systems by pushing or pulling data from one source to another, those bots are very effective in automating those tasks, and thereby free up the human capital to focus on more strategic pursuits. So these are the 4 steps that I'll now walk through in some detail. If you click to the next slide, we'll again kind of start with this step 1 of applying AI to procurement, and it really starts with spend analytics. And there's a quote here from Gartner: vendors such as Zycus and a couple of others that have already using machine learning to improve spend classification. In a second, I'll give you kind of a quick demonstration for how effective artificial intelligence is and how much more effective it is than other methods. Certainly, a lot of man hours, for instance, to sift through massive amounts of data to accurately categorize and classify spend data transactions. And after all, we're talking about, for most organizations, hundreds of millions of, if not billions of dollars in spend, and a multiple of that in terms of the transactions and line items of data that you have to go through. So we'll talk about how, as Gartner says, vendors such as Zycus are already using machine learning to improve spend classification. Then we'll delve into what comes next. Well, the next step, as Gartner mentions here, is to then explore the predictive spend analytics that can further improve the planning and prioritization of strategic sourcing activities. So use AI to take it to the next step, to really provide some structured insights and suggestions to help prioritize the work to make sure that we're focusing on the most strategic pursuits possible. So click to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about how AI is already being applied very effectively to accurately categorize and classify spend transactions. So we'll start with the before picture and kind of a transaction register that is fairly typical for a lot of organizations, in particular global organizations. As you see here, you've got multiple purchase transactions from different geographies around the world. When you look at the line level details, the item descriptions, in some cases they're pretty good, but many cases it's very cryptic. There may be a brand name, there may be a model number, there may be no description in some cases. And then you may have a material group or material code. Some cases no code has been applied, but when you look at material groups, for most organizations, the way that data is categorized in their ERP systems is not particularly meaningful from a strategic sourcing standpoint. So it doesn't really tell me a lot if I've got a category of purchases in my material group that says it's a mainframe or it's computers. I really need to have a much more granular view of what those transactions actually represent. So if you click ahead, what we're really dealing with here is certainly the phenomenon of garbage in and garbage out. So you've got inaccurate, incomplete, or cryptic data here. And if you click ahead too, we kind of look at some of the other complications. You've got distributed data across multiple geographies, different languages. So being able to translate that into a common lexicon is a challenge, multiple classification standards being applied. So of course the output is relatively inaccurate data with low spend visibility and really a hindrance to achieving the strategic objectives of driving better savings, higher ROI, by being able to interrogate and interpret that spend data and leverage it in strategic negotiations with suppliers. So if you click to the next slide, we'll kind of take a look at the magic that AI applies here. So taking all of these transactions and running it through that machine learning algorithm and in the artificial intelligence, what the AI tool is able to do is look at these different clues or cues that appear in the data. So triangulating across multiple factors, the item description, a GL code or material group code, a supplier name, and looking at historical patterns, being able to then categorize and classify those transactions in the appropriate and granular type of view that tells you, in fact, for each of these particular purchase lines, the actual category is notebook computers. So whereas before we just had these broad buckets that really are not particularly meaningful, that there was an office supplies or mainframe or computer purchases, now we know that in fact each of these spend transactions is for a notebook computer. So now when I go to market for a strategic sourcing project for that category, notebook computers, I know exactly how much I'm buying in that particular area. So what is my leverage from a volume standpoint, truly on a global basis, to be able to more effectively complete those negotiations. So if you'll click ahead and build out the rest for me. So now we've remedied the situation of garbage in, garbage out with now quality in and quality out. So leveraging artificial intelligence, which provides the statistical model for dealing with erroneous or cryptic or incomplete data to now really make sense of those patterns. So that's really a demonstration of how AI, in the first instance, can provide accurate and actionable spend visibility. So if you click to the next slide, we'll kind of take on the next frontier that Gartner mentioned in their quote is, how do we get to the next generation of spend analytics? And I would say that there are 4 Ps here. So the first one, applying AI to become more prescriptive. And what I mean by that, and shown in the example here, is how the tools can mine that spend data and actually serve up to an end user, let's say a category manager, on a proactive basis, some specific savings opportunities that they can immediately act upon. So rather than having this kind of be that pull model where a user has to go into the spend data and format a number of reports to pull from that spend cube to sort of find on their own what the opportunities may be. Here, the AI is presenting that directly to the user and saying, you know, you've got opportunities in your particular category to either rationalize the spend, aggregate the demand across the globe, and leverage that in your negotiations, or there may even be additional savings opportunities from things such as simply rationalizing payment terms with your existing suppliers because they're not always in compliance with your standard terms. So that's an example of the next generation of spend analytics becoming more prescriptive. If you'll click ahead, we'll talk about the second P here, which is becoming more proactive. So this is really an exciting area where AI is being applied today to provide that kind of automated alerts and notifications to a user to be able to manage spending and manage a category really on more of a lights out basis. So it gives the user the ability to set up automated alerts and reminders around key events or activities. So if you think about it, I'm managing a category of a product or service, and I want to know anytime there's a price increase, or I want to know anytime there's a deviation of the price paid according to the spend transaction information from the actual contracted rate. So I make sure I'm driving compliance. I want to know and give me an automated alert anytime someone makes a purchase in my category from someone other than the approved contracted vendor. So really being able to remediate and immediately address any incidents of maverick purchasing or non-compliance. Another example would be, for many contracts, I may negotiate things like a volume discount rebate structure. Well, too often, procurement professionals have found that they're sort of at the mercy of the supplier to track that on their behalf and come forward when those thresholds are triggered. Here, the system can set up the alert to let me know I'm at or near or I've exceeded a certain volume threshold and that I should be entitled to a rebate. So just some examples here of how AI can be utilized to create this kind of lights out environment where the system notifies me to key events that I can now take action upon. So that's the second P. If you'll click ahead, we'll talk about the third P is how do we now make this more predictive? So spend analytics, very valuable tool, but it historically has been limited to just that, historical spending. How do we get a more forward-looking view? So what the tools are doing at this point now is melding and meshing together both your internal historical spend data with external commodity market indices and forecasts. So now I can look at my particular historical buying volumes and patterns and project based on what the market trends are from a pricing and availability standpoint, what the future cost and pricing of those commodities would be, so that I can now predict what my spending will be in the future. So it's no longer just a rear view mirror of what's already happened, but a more predictive view to what is likely to happen in the future to allow me to make the appropriate contingency plans in the meantime. And if you'll click ahead, the fourth P that we're talking about here is how do these tools now become more participative? So in the past, access to spend analytics has been limited to a fairly finite group of users, typically just in the procurement function, category managers, and in some cases data analysts within procurement that have the technical dexterity and category knowledge to know how to create filters to gather the data appropriately and so on. In this next generation, it's really about the fact that anyone in the business may need insights to spend analytics at some point, at some time or another. Even if something as simple as I need to go make a sort of a one-off purchase, I want to know who did we buy this from last and what was the last price paid. But I don't have intimate knowledge of how the tools work. So in this case, being able to use a natural language processing NLP kind of a search method, so that I can just put in a natural language search term and have the artificial intelligence understand what I'm looking for and be able to aggregate and synthesize that data. Even in the case of something as simple as I just want to know who did we buy this from last and what was the last price paid. So some examples here of the next generation of spend analytics. If you take me to the next slide, please. So step 2, how does AI enable a better user experience to guide users through the process towards better outcomes and better data as a result? And I'll talk about a couple of different kinds of users. In the first example, we'll talk about how guided buying can enable any end user requester in the business. So they wouldn't be a procurement professional with any sort of advanced knowledge of the market or the category. They're just an end user out there in the business who needs a product or service to do their job. So guided buying can really demystify that process for an end user, and I'll just kind of walk you through an example of how it works. And it starts right from the initial search, which I would argue is kind of the moment of truth when it comes to a tool like Procure to Pay, where you've got end users going in to create requisitions for the products or services that they need. And oftentimes we kind of describe the experience that we want in terms of the consumer experience, make it Google-like, for example. I actually think that's a bit of a misnomer when it comes to Procure to Pay, because anyone who's searched on Google know that you have this, what you get back in terms of search results is this vast trove of information, but much of it may be irrelevant to what you actually were looking for in the first place. So how AI remedies that is actually to take my natural language search term. In this case, I put in screwdriver. And I don't, as an end user, don't need to know that the actual category name for that is a power tool or a hand tool. I just know that I'm looking for a screwdriver. The challenge with the traditional search is I may get any result that has either of those keywords anywhere in the short or long description, either screw or driver. So I may get a lot of unintended search results in that case. Here, the AI does that conversion on my behalf and presents me with the appropriate category that's going to return only relevant search results. The second step, the artificial intelligence knows that for that particular category, my organization has specified 2 approved contracted vendors. So the user is presented only with those appropriate vendors and the right buy pay channel to make that purchase, so that you don't have the potential for a non-compliant or a maverick purchase. It's going to be made with the approved vendor at contracted rates. And then the third step is the AI really simplifies the entire process for the end user, not just the initial search and point and click to place the item in the shopping cart, but when I go to check out, I don't have to know what the appropriate approval workflow is based on the category that's been selected, based on other business rules, such as the dollar amount of the purchase, and my user profile. The system knows who to route that requisition to for approval. It's defaulted the category code and mapped it to the right GL code, so the user doesn't have to enter some 15-digit account string and guess at what the right category code, or even input their ship to and bill to information. It's all been defaulted on behalf of the end user. So that's an example of how AI can introduce this kind of a guided buying approach to improve the user experience and also improve the accuracy and compliance from a data standpoint. So the next step, if you'll click to the next slide, would really look at the procurement professional as a different category of user. So AI in this situation is providing multiple suggestions as a procurement professional goes through the kinds of activities that they're typically involved in, sourcing and contracting. So for instance, when I'm going to initiate a sourcing project, AI can look at the past historical patterns of data and look at things like my existing supplier's performance from a scorecard and suggest to me which suppliers should I consider for shortlisting for this particular RFP, if you will. Can also look at past buying patterns and understand, is an RFP approach, is an auction approach, which approach is likely to yield the best savings results. The AI tools also can look at my historical process cycle times and also a broader community of users to say, how long should the sourcing process take so I can create an appropriate project plan, or the contracting process. So the AI can therefore provide me an alert that says for this particular category, typically this has been a relatively long cycle contracting process of 3 months or more. So notify me well in advance that it's the time for me to initiate that process. And the other insights that AI can provide is looking at multiple data points to understand, based on the product or service that I'm contracting for, what inherent risk might there be, and therefore what clauses and protections should be included when I structure that agreement. So just a few examples here of how AI can guide not only end users, non-procurement professionals, through the requisitioning and ordering process, but can also provide great insights and guidance to seasoned professionals to make better strategic sourcing and contracting decisions. Next slide. So I want to get step 3 now, which is really digitizing the entire source-to-pay process, connecting the dots, and really eliminating any pockets of paper throughout. So if you'll click ahead and build out for me, we're going to look at the source-to-pay process, and keep on clicking for me, because we're going to look at strategic process, spend analytics, sourcing, contracts, supplier management, supplier performance, as well as the operational e-procurement and e-invoicing. And what we want to make sure we don't overlook is those contiguous processes, that connective tissue that I mentioned earlier. Request management on the front end of source to pay, and outside the core procurement process, non-procurement managed tail spend and financial savings management, reporting and tracking. So with this as a framework in mind, if you click to the next slide, we'll really start to drill into source to pay, if you will. And what are the objectives of digitization? I think it's important to keep focus on the fact that at the end, it's not just about converting paper to electronic formats. It's about achieving superior performance. So here's kind of a roadmap or a series of benchmarks that contrast average performance with best-in-class performance. And across any number of these key metrics, whether you're looking at spend under management or the savings rate that's captured, the amount of spend that you're able to source, or cycle time performance, there's a vast discrepancy between what the best-in-class organizations have accomplished and what the overall average is for everyone else. And the clear differentiator has been the extent to which these core sourcing and procurement processes have been digitized or automated to give that real competitive advantage. So just a kind of a quick look here at what is the ultimate end game. The objective is to achieve kind of best-in-class performance through digitization of source to pay. You click to the next slide, please.
Just as we're moving the slide, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give the second of today's 3 secret words. Supply is secret word number 2. That's S-U-P-P-L-Y. And we're going to turn things back over to Richard. Richard, apologies for the interruption, but back to you.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. And so while we're on the topic of kind of benchmarking, the value here is to kind of understand where you are relative to the industry overall, and therefore identify gaps to really close. If you're going to take advantage, as I kind of mentioned in the thesis at the outset here, around machine teaching, your machines can only learn from the extent that you're able to feed it with digitized information that's accurate, quality kind of information. So this would be a good way to start that process, is look at some of the core transactions in the procurement process, from recs to POs to invoices to payments, and to what extent are you already digital today. So there's kind of a target that says full automation might be at somewhere between 95 and 98%, according to this Hackett Group study. No one's quite there yet across the board, but certainly there's this huge dichotomy, if you will, between what the top performers have achieved and what the average or peer group overall is. And I'll just highlight really the key transactions here: the PO, the invoice, and the payment. So if you start with the initial purchase order, 85% of POs are fully electronic for the top performers, whereas only 1 in 3 for the average organization overall. So that's going to clearly have a big impact on your ability to analyze those purchase transactions on the back end and make meaningful decisions as a result. So, this is an electronic purchase order, means that a requisition was entered electronically, it was routed for approval electronically, a PO was created and dispatched, so delivered to the supplier electronically. And oh, by the way, an email attachment doesn't count, because a true electronic transaction, such as a PO, would need to be sent via a standard protocol like EDI or CXML, or through a portal interface such that manual data entry is not required. The same thing when it comes to invoices, and certainly getting an electronic PO is almost a prerequisite to being able to get an electronic invoice back from your suppliers, because the technology, for instance, enables that supplier to do what we call a PO flip. Actually take the line level information from the PO and flip it into an electronic invoice back to the buying organization. So that's going to increase the likelihood that the invoice and PO and goods receipt, in the case of a three-way match, go through on a first pass match, that there aren't any errors, or either data entry errors or transposition or changes that would result in a mismatched invoice. So 79% of invoices are being received electronically by the top performers, just 28% overall. Now, the gap is narrower when it comes to payments, so most organizations have at least made some pretty good progress towards replacing paper checks with electronic payments, such as electronic funds transfer, ACH transactions, or card payments. But even there's still a gap between those top performers at better than 81% electronic payments and 63% for the average organization. So if you're at the average, or maybe even below the average, this is certainly a place to focus along the path towards machine teaching, which is to digitize as much of the process and as many of the transactions as possible. Next slide, please. So when you look at digitizing or transforming source to pay, that's often a kind of a daunting task for a lot of organizations, just given the scope and the magnitude on a global basis. So it is often helpful to look at what is a best practice for transforming, for sequencing the transformation of source to pay, or phasing. This comes from Gartner, and it's given a clean sheet of paper. If you were approaching this problem from that standpoint, it's certainly hard to argue with this approach. You'd start with mapping your external spend to get that spend analytics and insights to inform your strategic sourcing approach, and then execute that through an e-sourcing capability, then manage compliance through tools like Procure to Pay, Contract Lifecycle Management, Vendor Managed Services, and then on an ongoing basis, really look at supply-based management and managing supplier relationships. Now, not everyone has a clean sheet of paper. It may have started at a different point for a variety of reasons, but whether it's this sort of best practice or classic approach, or a custom approach unique to your business, it's important to have a roadmap, a playbook, and how you're going to tackle these challenges to get to the end game of full digitization. Next slide, please. So what is it worth? When I say get to this transformation of source to pay, I just wanted to kind of take a look at in quantifiable ROI kind of terms, what is the opportunity, let's say, of just going from good to great? So if we compared all those various benchmarks that I shared earlier, and just looked at the incremental improvement of going from an average level of performance to best in class. An organization, let's say, that has $1 billion in spend and, you know, certain representative kind of transaction volumes and so on, would improve their performance to the tune of an incremental $21.4 million of realized bottom line savings. So I think from an ROI standpoint, obviously your results may vary because, for one thing, your baseline may be different. You may not be at the average benchmark. You may be slightly better, may be well below, in which case the upside potential would be greater. But certainly very quantifiable hard dollar benefit that can be expressed in an ROI business case that's going to be extremely compelling for an organization of any size when it comes to the amount of spend that they're managing. So next slide, let's just take a look at a different way to express the opportunity of digitizing source to pay, in this case from the standpoint of speed and cycle time. So here let's look at what we'll call the source to cash cycle. So that cycle starts when I initiate a sourcing project with a request for quote or request for proposal, goes through the negotiation and award, the contracting stage, and then putting that new agreement in place and onboarding a supplier, sending them a PO, getting an invoice back. So ultimately completing that source to cash cycle when I pay that invoice against the new agreement and can actually book the savings from the new by comparing the new contracted price to the old one. And the average performance overall is that cycle time takes 104 days to complete, whereas a best-in-class organization that's realizing the benefits of speed that come with digital transformation is completing it in 60 days, so 42% faster. So in some respects, a non-monetary, more of a cycle time look here, but of course, that could be converted to an actual financial benefit, just looking at the net present value on a discounted cash flow basis of booking those savings, some 42% faster than the average overall. So just another way to look at the opportunity. If you take me to the next slide. I want to start to talk then about, once you've maximized or optimized your core sourcing and procurement process, the source to pay process, digitized it, now let's look at how, outside of the procurement function, how we interface to the organization overall. And best-in-class companies are really looking at how do they become more customer-centric. And there are relatively few of those. Just 20% either have a customer management organization or a formal role for that, whereas 80% is much more ad hoc. But there's clearly a correlation between a focus on this area where 56% of best-in-class organizations have adopted formal service level agreements with their internal customers as compared to just 34% of the peer group. So in practical terms, how can we become more customer-centric with external stakeholders? In the next slide, we'll take a look at kind of an emerging space here called procurement request management. Lots of requests get lobbed into the procurement function on a regular basis these days. It's just in a very haphazard and unstructured way, usually emails and phone calls. So this new application model is to create kind of a portal to the procurement process, a more structured way of submitting a variety of requests. It may be, I need procurement to help onboard a supplier, create a contract, conduct a sourcing project, just as an example. But here you're applying a structured process with a forms-based data entry and approval routing and management to adjudicate those requests, and full visibility to the end users on the disposition, because too often times the the requester, calls in or sends an email, but feels like their request has gone into the black hole. So the value here is to provide that kind of structure to this process. And if you'll build out the rest here, then take those input requests and actually feed the downstream applications, be it sourcing or contract management, et cetera. So the next slide, I'll just give you a quick case study example. This is from Porsche that has utilized this approach to automate request management and really apply quite a bit of structure. In their case, conditional approval workflows with greater than 175 different sort of permutations or conditions, often multiple levels of approval. And what that does for the procurement team is make sure that when it lands in their work queue, that they know that they're working on a priority project that's been appropriately approved. From an end user standpoint, now I've got visibility to know what the status and disposition is. So I'm much more connected to procurement as an end user stakeholder. So next slide, please. Now, on this theme of customer centricity, certainly the goal is to provide transparency and visibility, self-service access to tools for end users, but it doesn't mean that all customers are created equal. So one of the strategies that's been employed here is to make sure, as you look at the spending that's depicted here, 40% of spending sort of warrants a global category strategy. In some cases, it may be on a business unit or country level, but the typical organization might have 75% of spending that warrants focus by the centralized procurement function from a category management strategic sourcing standpoint. That's because the spend dollars are bigger, the corresponding savings opportunities are larger. But every organization, and this is kind of a typical profile here, might have somewhere around 25% of spending that's either tactical or even true tail spend that's outside of procurement's purview that don't manage directly. So the new approach has been to say we're going to continue to focus our resources on that 75% of spend, but how do we deploy self-service tools to end users to make sure that we're not sub-optimizing that 25% of spend that's going to be managed centrally. So the next slide, I'll just give you a quick example of how the tools have evolved. In this case, a quick source tool that would enable that 25% of tactical or tail spend that procurement doesn't touch to still be competitively sourced and negotiated. So an end user using a sort of a one-page RFQ form-based model could very quickly and easily conduct a tactical kind of a self-service sourcing event, 3 bids and a buy, if you will, on a single screen, and even be able to just create and invite new suppliers on the fly. So procurement didn't have to touch it and get involved, but you have much greater assurance that it's a compliant purchase, that at least you're getting a market price because you've introduced 3 or more competitive bidders to the mix. So that's an example of tail spend sourcing there. Next slide, please. Yeah, when we talk about the outputs then from the procurement process, even those that have done a really good job of digitizing their core S2P process don't always do a very effective job of communicating the value delivered to the business. So when it comes to financial savings management reporting, most organizations are doing this today. It's just they're doing this oftentimes with a different either legacy or spreadsheet-based applications that don't have the ability to collaborate with different stakeholders, specifically to get finance approval and sign off, that don't have the consistency in applying the savings calculation and allocation methodologies to make the results acknowledged by the business and in particular by finance. So take you to the next slide. I'll just give another quick case study example here of how a tool, in this case, it's a financial savings management tool called iSave, is deployed at Qualcomm with some pretty dramatic results. So increasing the volume of savings projects that are tracked and incremental savings that are realized by getting that broader visibility and dramatic productivity as well. So whereas category managers had to spend about 2 hours of every day just gathering and reporting on savings, automating this process to make the results actually auditable and verified by finance, and really freeing up those individuals to not have to do data gathering, but do much higher value added strategic sourcing tasks. So take me to the next slide. I wanted to come to the fourth and final step in our process here. So we talked about getting the master data right at the source in step one, and applying artificial intelligence to cleanse and classify the data, and to progressively, as the machines learn from more effective machine teaching, categorize that data on a repeatable basis. We talked about AI to guide users through the process. We talked about digitizing source to pay. And the fourth and final step we're going to talk about here is how can we apply a tool like robotic process automation to really fully automate and mechanize and take the human interaction out of the processes that really don't make sense to have humans involved in, because they're repetitive and tactical and mundane, and all of those, for all those reasons, can introduce the potential for errors. So as we look across the different processes involved here, certainly those that have a higher proportion of transactional or manual tasks are really the best candidates for RPA. So the lowest hanging fruit has been in the areas of accounts payable. If you think about entering invoice data or matching invoices to POs and goods receipts and those kinds of things. Requisition and order management, again, entering data into a requisition or determining approval workflow paths. But there are other applications, even in more strategic aspects, such as contract management, sourcing, et cetera. So take me to the next slide. I'll just share with you, a final example here of one of the things that's being done, that Zycus is doing specifically with RPA, and deploying what we call a Merlin AI Studio. So this is really a menu, a library of bots that are configured for specific applications. So just some quick examples here. A contract metadata extraction bot. So you're bringing in legacy agreements or third-party paper, a supplier contract, and you want to get the metadata, which is kind of that header level information, consistent throughout. So not a very appealing task for humans to have to wade through hundreds of pages from tens of thousands of contracts that are all formatted differently. Here the bot can apply that kind of artificial intelligence to really structure the data, make it meaningful. Bots for other purposes, approval reminders. For some of those very tactical sourcing projects, whereas I talked about the quick source that an end user could easily do, in some cases for very low dollar value transactions, the bot may actually go out and do the price discovery and even complete a truly autonomous purchase by awarding the business on a complete lights out or touchless basis. So a number of different examples here, but I think I've covered really the core context here of how artificial intelligence and machine learning is being used today in the real world and can be deployed effectively, and in the future how this will just continue to drive increased levels of performance improvement. So with that, I want to turn it back. I know we have a few minutes left maybe for some final summary and thoughts.
That we most certainly do. Ladies and gentlemen, just before we do dive into some audience questions, I'd like to give the third and final secret word of the day, which is cost. That's C-O-F-T. So a couple of questions from the audience here, Richard, relating to, the first one's relating to sort of best practice, I imagine. When is the right time for an organization to adopt AI in procurement, do you think?
Yeah, well, the time is now. Really, we're talking about how the tools will continue to evolve, and so it will become more and more pronounced over time. But most of the examples that I've shared today are being used today in real time. So really, there's no reason to wait. AI, properly applied, can really drive an order of magnitude kind of productivity and performance improvement. So the time is now.
Excellent. And another one, I think this is also relating to implementation here. What processes would you consider the best targets for any sort of pilot program or maybe a proof of concept when you're considering implementing AI or RPA?
Yeah, I do think the lowest hanging fruit is to find any processes that are highly structured today. So there's not variability. It's the same input form or output format if it's a report or something like that. Because the utility of the machines, of the bots, is to perform that repetitive operation over and over and over again, and to do it 24/7 and just execute an instruction as programmed flawlessly. So that's any of those kind of structured processes which don't have variability. And again, some of the easiest opportunities may be in areas like AP or in the requisition and PO processing area. The other thing not to be overlooked is one of the biggest challenges for a lot of organizations is having to integrate multiple systems. So if data is stored in multiple locations, think about an organization in particular that's grown through merger and acquisition that has multiple different back-end legacy or ERP environments. And for them, traditional kinds of approaches to systems integration could be cost prohibitive or time, too time consuming. And that's an area where RPA can be used to essentially push and pull data from one system to the next on an ongoing basis and perform that kind of systems integration function without the same type of expense or complexity of traditional, creating application interfaces and systems integration.
Excellent. I think we've got time to squeeze in one more question before we get some final thoughts. This one's two parts. So do you think that AI or RPA will replace people in the process? And what do you think are some of the more medium and longer term implications of the implementation of AI?
Yeah, it'd be great to say that no jobs will be lost due to AI, and RPA, and I don't think that's true. But I think the good news is the upshot of this will be to make those jobs more fulfilling and more rewarding, because the roles that will be replaced are the ones that the most clerical, the most tactical roles that really aren't the type of things that people want to do anyway. And everyone is tasked of doing these days more with less, and so that the opportunity to drive productivity doesn't include adding people. So it's really yes, some roles will be changed, but in most cases, what we're talking about is reallocating the people to more fulfilling, more higher value-added roles and tasks.
Excellent. And I think really the way we want to sort of close this webcast, I think we've got some time for some final thoughts from yourself. So really just one or two sort of points that you feel are most pertinent, your key takeaways from today's presentation.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that that I talked about, at least briefly here, was how distinct the dichotomy is between how big the gap is between what is actually being accomplished in terms of true performance metrics by best in class versus everyone else. And when you boil it down, what can you attribute that significant disparity in performance to? And it really comes down to the application of the technology. We're in that next revolution. We had the industrial revolution, and certainly we're in the technology revolution age. And I think it's just so compelling that there's no reason to stand on the sidelines. I mentioned the time to do it is now. The technology is real. It only continues to improve. But the opportunity to take and harness this technology and drive competitive advantage is real.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to thank Richard Wolf and the attendees for carving time out of their busy schedules and helping to make this event such a success. Just a very quick reminder that if you did want some free continuing education credits, you can share your insights with us. We're conducting our continuing education success survey to improve the knowledge group and to help it better serve you. So for 10 minutes on the phone, we can give you 3 months of free CE webcast. Just click the link found in the chat box to sign up and participate. And as always, we look forward to hearing from you. Just a very quick reminder before we do close, if you are applying for continuing education credit, the completion of that survey is mandatory. State bars and boards require that we maintain a completed survey for each attendee. And if you have requested a recording of the event or a certificate of attendance, you'll be receiving all the relevant information via email within the next 24 to 48 hours. You can follow us on Twitter at @no_group. You can also like us on Facebook to receive updates for this event, as well as other news and pertinent information. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes today's event on machine teaching, apply AI for predictive procurement. If you do have any questions intended for Mr. Wolf that perhaps we didn't get to today, you can send us an email, info@theknowledgegroup.org. You can also contact them individually using the information provided within the event's materials. If you can't find that information for whatever reason, just send us an information request. That email address again is info@theknowledgegroup.org.